All right, you happily miserable accursed. It's a sunny Monday morning. The air is crisp. The Riders have clinched a playoff spot. The Canadians are about to start playing hockey. Let's get this pod underway. We're approaching endgame. Speaking of sports, we're approaching endgame in federal politics. David Herle here with your political panel, Scott Reid, Jordan Leichnitz, and Kory Teneycke. Here's the rundown for today. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. To prorogue or not to prorogue? That's the question today. Our cursed clipping is Campbell Clark's piece in the Globe about Poilievre edging toward admitting he'll take the knife to some liberal social programs. Then Prime Minister Trudeau is selectively appearing on podcasts. Not this podcast. Nate Erskine-Smith's podcast, Uncommons, where he talked successes and failures and laid down some track about the next election. We'll break that down. Then the eternal Mr. Pinsent will call for our Hey Yous. Kory, Scott, Jordan, how are you? And keep it tight because Reid's got a hard stop today, so we're banterless today. Everybody okay?
We're here. No. We're caffeinated.
No.
Yeah, we're good. We're 90 minutes later than normal, so I'm even more ready for this. Let's go.
Excellent. Okay, so I want to get your views on prorogation. I think the more I think about it, the more I think it's an integral part of any Liberal comeback. They need the field to themselves. If they do it, they could introduce a fall economic statement with measures, and then they could prorogue, and they eliminate all the noise from question period, from committees, from procedural stuff in the House, and they have the field to themselves. They've changed their government advertising rules so they can advertise their fall economic statement. Then they can run the negative ads they apparently have prepared so they can unleash their party advertising. Then they could come back and deliver a budget in the spring and run on that budget. But if they're in the House playing defense every day, I don't know how that happens. So Kory, what do you think?
Well, I agree with you. It is the ultimate reset button for a government to press. I think it's also very true that any day that the House is sitting is a bad day for the government. Any day a legislature is sitting is a bad day for the government. It comes with a bunch of focus and criticism and question period and on and on. All of those things are not helpful. But in a minority parliament without a cooperation agreement with NDP, it makes it all of that, but more so, because whereby they were able to use their agreement to basically quiet down committees and operate more or less like a majority government around those issues, maybe with a little negotiation on the side with NDP in certain areas. But for better or worse, call it a operating like a majority government. They don't have that now, and so I agree. It's I think an obvious smart thing for them to consider doing. But I'll temper it with this, and we're going to get into this in the Erskine-Smith podcast. If it's just to go and keep doing what you've been doing, then why bother? Just get it over with.
I hear that, Scott. What do you think about prorogation?
Well, I think one of the most interesting things about it is that the government has dismissed it, right? So the House leaders asked about it explicitly, and she says, it's not on the plate. Now, our pal Fasci Capello suggested that after the House leaders said that, there might have been some quiet calls saying, well, that's not necessarily 100%, backed into that corner. But still, it tells you, I just think that's an instructive thing that, and I know I'll also hint forward to the Nate Erskine-Smith discussion, this impulse to be like, well, we're not going to look weak. We're going to look strong and march, not crawl into the oncoming locomotive. So what do I think? I think that they should prorogue. I think they should do it. I think they should go into it a prorogation on the strongest possible terms. And I think they should use it signal and to make difference. I think they should put a prorogation to work, because using a prorogation to simply evade parliamentary accountability isn't going to help them eventually. That's just a delay, not any side of indication of change. So to me, the thing to do, I do think the government deserves credit tactically, the way that it's managed its House agenda. Get those opposition days up front, get those votes of confidence out of the way right away when you know that the other parties aren't necessarily prepared to go. So, I think I would try to stick handle until November. I would bring in a fall economic statement. I do a cabinet shuffle, a fall economic statement. I would have measures. I think, and get a confidence vote on that. So, try to make it attractive to the NDP, get a vote of confidence on it so that you're going out with strength. And then on that basis, you then prorogue. And then you have optionality. Then you shuffle your cabinet and change the play. You announce that you're reversing course on the consumer carbon tax. The prime minister decides that he's not leaving, and you have a leadership race. So, you use that time to change where you're at and what you're saying to Canadians and what you're promising to Canadians in whatever way you can, and then you come back. But we'll see if they're going to do that. I mean, listening to the Prime Minister and the Nate Erskine-Smith thing left me with the impression that they're radically committed to the status quo and all that implies.
Is it going to be possible to keep the Nate Erskine-Smith podcast separate from this discussion, or do we just have to merge them?
I think we're going to jump in because it's just such an elephant in the room.
It's a rich text.
All right, well, Jordan, before we do that, give me your view on prorogation.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if I'm the Liberals, it's looking real appealing right now, and I think it's interesting to point out, the pain of the House right now is so intense. It's requiring so much energy and focus from the government just to deal with the day-to-day nonsense that's coming because of the dissolution of the Supply and Confidence Agreement. And so this is for all those folks out there who thought the dissolution changed nothing. This is actually a really important thing that it changed. And what it's done is it's pulled the Liberals deeper into exactly the place that they should not be spending time and focus and energy, which is machinations of the House, dealing with things at committee, being sucked further and further into that. And so I think it's a very appealing option.
They can't get an offense while they're doing that, right, Jordan?
Well, that's right. They cannot. They are the amount of just procedural nonsense that's bogging them down right now is unbelievable. And so I think that in order to create space, it is kind of a no-brainer that this is something that they would look at. And I would say certainly they're going to be opposed to it until the minute that they're for it. And I would remember that the last time that the government did this was in August 2020 when they prorogued the House in the height of the We Charity scandal. You guys all might remember that. So they're certainly not allergic to beating a hasty retreat in difficult circumstances. So I think that there's obviously some appetite for that within that team. And it would allow them the potential to use the time for a reset. Now, I don't maybe share some of the confidence that they are going to be able to pull that off, because I think if we go back to the Erskine-Smith discussion with the Prime Minister, there is every indication that they are just quadrupling down on what they're currently doing, which doesn't suggest to me that they would use that time to have a radical reset. But at minimum, it would pull them out of the day-to-day morass of the House, let them look a little bit outwards towards where voters and where Canadians are, and have some opportunity to think about their strategy absent do or die scenarios that are coming at them every week.
Yeah. Okay. So the Nate Erskine-Smith thing, for listeners that may not be aware of this, Nate Erskine-Smith is a Liberal caucus member, a Liberal MP, has a podcast. It's a good one, by the way. And Prime Minister went on it last week, so there was two caucus colleagues chatting with each other. Nate asked all the right questions, but I didn't think Trudeau gave very many of the right answers. And what really struck me was his, and this links back to what you would do with a prorogation period. It was his refusal to lay out any forward-looking agenda or to put anything in the window of what he was working toward. He wants to run on himself. Whatever challenges confront us, he's the best person to deal with it. His record shows that. He's not going to run on having better ideas or better policies. He's going to run on as the guy you trust to run the country. Where does he see that in the data? Where does he find that out there in public opinion? It's very similar, if I could say, to the campaign his dad ran in 1979 in a similar circumstance. And let I remind people, that campaign won 45 seats in English Canada. 45.
Yeah, it's the noises made by a delusional narcissist is what it is. I but just, I feel like I have to comment that Nate's first question, also that of a narcissist. Hey, Prime Minister, now that I've got you here alone, what do you think about me? let's just get right into it with the important stuff.
Yeah. I would have too much self-awareness to ask the Prime Minister that question.
I don't know. Anyway, but talk about two narcissists sitting down for a chat, and both of them being a bit delusional. But the notion that the question in front of people is the Prime Minister have the energy necessary to fight an election campaign? Does he have the fire in his belly? Like, other than himself, is there anyone in the country who is actually thinking of it that way? And then, he layers on top of that, well, basically all of the things that we've done since 2015, like 2015 was this terrible, dark time where the country was in such turmoil. And, he's basically describing the world of Mordor, with smoke billowing from furnaces and orcs ravaging through the countryside. Like, that's not what was happening in 2015. Like, I understand why post 2015 his life is better. He's back living in the mansion next to the one he grew up in as the Prime Minister, with a lot of people to listen to his thoughts and cater to his whims. But for the rest of the country, 2015 wasn't some terrible dark time. And some of the things that he thinks have made the world a lot better, Canadians would say have made it a lot worse. They don't feel like their life has improved since then. They feel like housing is more expensive, that their groceries are more expensive, that the amount of economic anxiety they're feeling is greater. And if you were to give them the option of, hey, do you think having Stephen Harper back would be better than having this clown continue for another 4 years, it would be a pretty conclusive answer, and not the way that he thinks it would be. I don't think he's understanding what the point is, right? Like, I think he's completely lost the script. There are also some things that he said that I gotta ask you guys to decode for me, because I could not understand them at all. When he's talking about how the Canadian electorate made a distinct, a decision back then to not build the economy from the center out, but to build it from the center out, not from the top down, and that there was a decision made to do that. What the fuck does that mean? Like, what does that mean, right? Like, it's just progressive word salad bafflegab.
That was a Biden slogan. That was explicitly a Biden slogan. So that's
sure. So
although he did say in the 2015 election that they were going to build it from the heart out.
From the heart out, right? I do remember that. Also, totally meaningless. But if you're quoting an 85-year-old guy with dementia, and like that's what we're going to, I don't know, man. I don't think it's going to work out for you.
So, it was in this space last week where I was pondering this seemingly odd notion of our presenting sponsor TELUS, a technology company, getting into home building in a rather large way. Seemingly is the operative word here, Hurly-Burlyites, because frankly, it ain't really all that odd. And I'll tell you why. It goes back to values, as everything with TELUS's business does. The initiative is called TELUS Living, if you recall, which strikes me as a good name, because it's a perfect example of TELUS living their values to improve the quality of life in the communities they serve through innovation. In this case, addressing the housing crisis by leveraging their advanced fiber network to build smart homes within mixed-use, purpose-built rental residential properties that represent a unique value proposition in the housing market. These are living spaces the working middle class can afford within 40% of their household income level. So they line up with TELUS's broader commitment to community investment and social responsibility. You know what else? They support TELUS's sustainability goals, because each of the 3 kickoff developments in BC, Nanaimo, Seychelles, and Saanich, promote green building practices, reducing environmental impact and contributing to long-term business growth and resilience. This is nothing less than TELUS redefining residential living, Hurley-Burleyites, creating forward-looking, vibrant, and connected communities. Shovels in the ground, values at the foundation. We'll wind up this series next week, but for now, go to telusliving.com to find out more. Scott, Smith was begging him to give him some North Star to point toward, some new Jerusalem that we could be promised in the campaign, and Trudeau would not give it to him, right? Running on the record.
Well, a couple of things about that. Let's go. What struck me, just to go really deep on it and be very, very precise to illustrate the point. I'm not as personally harsh as Kory, and in fact, I'm going to take it away from the Prime Minister someplace else at conclusion of this, but just to dissect exactly what occurred and how revealing it is. Smith makes the comparison to 1980. Well, what happened in 1980 after, as you say, David, that suffering, humiliating, in many ways, campaign for Pierre Trudeau? Well, he came back and he said, look, here's this, and he said this, your interview last week with Lloyd Axe, really, he acknowledged something that you and I both said later that we didn't know, which is that he'd said this to caucus. Pierre Trudeau went to his own caucus.
Made his case to caucus about why he should come back.
And I'm sure it actually reflected his own perspective at this point. And he put it to the country essentially and said, look, let's face it, I'm not going to be hanging around here forever. He actually made an explicit commitment. I'm gone after this election. This is my last time. And you could see him sort of like, it was like a near-death experience or something. It was almost like he said, well, if I ever want to get this charter thing done, and a handful of other things, I now's the time, right? So I'm not going to waste my last kick of the can. And here's what you'll get. Here is the fucking bargain for voters, right? And what was clear, so he puts it to him in that, so what's the bargain you would offer? He didn't say those very words, but he used his father's example from 1980, asked him to say what would be the things that you would use this, ostensibly your final term, to accomplish. And 2 things happened. The first answer that Trudeau gave was, well, hang on. That's not what people are looking for in a prime minister anyway. People know that prime ministers get elected and you can't foresee what's going to happen. So really, they're just electing you on the basis of whether or not you have the right values. And I had the right values. I did in 2015. I do now. So that was the first. So first, he resisted the idea and the notion even that there's any merit in laying out that, or any benefit in picking up the comparison with his father's circumstance in 1980 and using it, which could be a flattering comparison because his father came back and won that election, obviously. And this second answer was that they're working on it. He said explicitly, we're working on that. We're building that. Because Nate kind of came back at him and said, Jesus, man, I'm begging you for a list. I want a list of 4 or 5 things. They don't have to rhyme in the way that Pierre Poilievre does it. We're going to axe the tax. We're going to dance the lance, whatever, right? But just give me a list. Give me a list, a handful of priorities that we can run that are forward-looking based on what you've done in the past. And he said, well, we're working on that. We're building on that. We'll come back to it. But what I really want to emphasize is that we have to first sell the things that we've done already. And then he goes through it. So,
but just one quick interjection. With then a pause to spend 25 minutes talking about proportional representation.
Well, I want to come back to that because I thought that was very interesting. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go back to that later. Yeah. But I just want to say this to wrap it up. What this tells you is, and the ad conversation illustrated the same, which is that, you know what, I didn't want to do ads, effectively what he says, I didn't want to do ads when Poilievre became leader because I thought that it would look like I was taking my eye off the ball of governing. Brackets, I looked weak like I was responding to him. And then secondly, it was the wrong time. You got to do this right time of sequencing, and that's closer when people are getting closer to the election. That argument, as you know, drives me insane, and it's fundamentally flawed because now it's virtually impossible to do those ads. In any event, both of those.
He was saying more than that. He was saying, I didn't want to take him serious. I didn't want to take him seriously because then people might take him as a serious option, and that wouldn't be good. Well, wow.
Here's where I just would like to land on this. These points of view that he's articulating are wrong. They are a flawed analysis of the circumstance that he finds himself in, and they are a failed prescription for how to compete the next election. And his advisors have an obligation to close the door and say, boss, we cannot win by running on the smorgasbord of programs that we pursued in 2020 and 2018. That's not what we're doing. And if we make this a contest of personal popularity, there is a raft of data that shows you will lose that. So it has to be a forward promise. It has to be a forward campaign. It has to be a clash of priorities moving forward. You have to demonstrate that there's something that people only get if you're the prime minister, and that's indispensable to them. And that argument has to be made. Lots of prime ministers think this way. Lots of prime ministers suck and complain that no one sees all the great things they've done and recognizes that this is the most important hinge moment in history, or pivot moment, as he called it. But people have to take him and say to him, no, we can't do it this way, boss. I'm sorry. You can't. It was a really disturbing podcast if you're a liberal, because it left me more dispirited than it was.
Yeah,
already.
I wish I hadn't heard either. Jordan, he said that I hate proportional representation myself, but he said that the reason it was bad is because it would make MPs beholden to the center. I thought that was funny.
Well, it wasn't the only funny thing about the proportional representation. Like, I think, God, like, we must be getting close to Halloween because the zombies are coming out. It was such an interesting choice, and like, so sort of like obviously a bit of a setup that he chose to articulate that. And I think there was a few fascinating things that came out of that. And the first is that he articulated the mistake. And so, he talked a little bit about ranked balloting and so on, and that he should have just been more clear that he only wanted ranked balloting and whatever. I think that we can go back in time and envision that would have not been such a smooth conversation as maybe he remembers it to have potentially been. But I thought it was fascinating that he actually believes that the mistake was not using his majority to bring in ranked ballot. Like, in the time and place that we're in right now, like, I find it so unthinkable that you would, anyway, for a government as ragingly unpopular as himself to consider muscling through a permanent and extremely large change to our voting system at a time of historically low confidence in democratic institutions seems like not a recipe for success to me. But I thought what was so interesting about that was not just the conversation that he had with Erskine Smith on the topic, because one would maybe naturally expect that to come up given who was interviewing, but that the PM, they clipped it and tweeted it on his account. So
yeah, they obviously want that to be the apology. This is the thing I'm acknowledging that I did wrong, but I'm not acknowledging the actual thing I did wrong. The actual thing I did wrong was lie to people and mislead them into thinking that I was going to support proportional representation. There is no advocacy for ranked ballots out there. Nobody who demands electoral reform wants ranked ballots.
No, and I thought it was really interesting because it's all, of course, happening in the context where the NDP is now in more of a position to exact demands. And so I wonder if we're also seeing play out a little bit of a, maybe a little bit of an offer, a little bit of a door opening, a little public negotiation happening. Anyway, I think he's going to be in for a surprise about how that stuff will be received. But I wanted to come back to some of the questions that Kory and Scott touched on, because I think it is such a rich text. And boy, if I were a liberal listening to this, and I had been worried before, I would now be completely alarmed, because the pattern of thinking that was exposed in this interview is so deeply disconnected from the reality, from all the data, from the electoral imperatives that are facing the Liberals right now, so as to be almost on a different planet. And I thought what was so fascinating is that he actually did in the interview kind of articulate a frame for the race as he sees it. And that is the frame of protecting progress. So not going backwards on climate, not going backwards on inclusion. And really, and this is about him. This is about him being the right person and his values. So he is actually not only buying into the notion that the election is going to be a referendum on him, but feeding it. He views that as a positive. And he's positively framing the race as being that himself, which I think is astounding given what we're seeing. And the offhand comment, which got a lot of ink elsewhere, as I think it rightly should, well, would anybody be saying this if I was 10 points ahead? Well, you're not, buddy. That is the problem. And so that's there's a real disconnect there. And related to that, he's putting forward, I think, an interesting frame, when he's asked about, as Scott was saying, to articulate, well, okay, what is your offer? What is your forward-looking offer? He kind of retreated to this conversation about, well, when they elected me in 2015, nobody knew the crises that were going to come. And this is fascinating because he's choosing here to talk about competence, to talk about governmental competence. And not only is this not really something that's viewed as his personal strength, it's not viewed as his government strength. And certainly in all the research I'm familiar with, and I assume it's the same for you guys, this expressly drives voters to conservatives. When you make this the test, you are driving voters to your opponent. And so for him to be talking about that as sort of a central component of how he wants to frame the race, I think should be really, really concerning. And he's really, the idea that this is something of a 2015 reboot. Again, very interesting because other than the fact that the NDP is now surpassing the Liberals outside of Quebec, it is not a 2015 reboot. There's 10 years of baggage. The fundamentals are really very, very different. And so I think that whoever whether he's come up with that himself or whoever is talking to him about that as a metaphor, it's wrong. It's wrong. And it's really harmful to how they're approaching the campaign. And then the very last thing, I also, like Scott, I thought the conversation that happened around the negative advertising about Poilievre was fascinating. So they're telling a couple stories to themselves about why they didn't do it and the rightness of why they didn't do it. Both stories are now evidently incorrect, and yet they continue to be told internally, which I think is a really interesting point. So the first is that they didn't want to advertise against Poilievre because it would make him seem too important. And then the second is that there's some magical thing that occurs as you get closer to a campaign where organically, you can sort of signal to voters what the stakes are. And then that ties to another thing that he said a little earlier in the conversation that I think should just be a red alert thing that should never really ever come out of a leader's mouth, which is that more Canadians need to look and ask what Pierre Poilievre is going to be doing and what that's going to mean for them. Nobody. That's your job. That is the job of your party. That is literally the job of parties in our system. And if you have not been able to make that case, you cannot expect voters in the midst of the crises that they're living through to just organically come to that conclusion. So, I think there's a lot of magical thinking in this. And maybe, and I did think he had one gem of a line, which is that hard things are hard sometimes. And there's some hard conversations that he needs to be having that clearly have not occurred yet.
That's been their saying for 10 years now. Hard things are hard. In any event, Kory, he seems to want to run a leadership-oriented campaign. Now, we've all seen campaigns where the leader's more popular than the party and you focus on the leader. But surely in this instance, you would be wanting to run the Liberal Party against the Conservative Party, not Trudeau against Poilievre. I mean, that comparison is settled and over, right? But there are vulnerabilities in the Conservative offering that could be exploited. They aren't Poilievre necessarily, but other things. And there are brand attributes to the Liberal Party that can be exploited. This idea that he has that he is the answer to winning, not that he can win if surrounded by the right things and the right thing, but that he personally is the answer to winning is so bizarrely messianic in these circumstances.
Yeah, well, like as I say, it's a narcissist answer to the question. Like, it's all entirely about him and framed around him and framed around personal attributes of him and some sort of shared belief that he believes exists out there that he is this heroic figure that is well-intentioned, this philosopher king riding on a steed into battle to fight on behalf of progressives against God knows what evil force. But in all of that, like, he can't define what is a progressive agenda. Like he can't even in that very ideological, personalized framework, he can't even give it a little bit more definition. And I think, insofar as there's stuff that he expressed frustration about, or some policy definition, it was in relation to Jagmeet Singh walking away from the agreement, and frustration about how he, seemingly had turned his back on carbon pricing, which I don't think is what Jagmeet Singh was saying in terms of that. He was saying, not done this way, and I'm going to come up with a different way, which is frankly what every premier in the country has said to him. And if you're to talk to most of his caucus or cabinet off the record, what they would say too. So, but just an inability to process that. What would I do instead? Well, obviously change leadership. Like, right. I think that's really, like, it's so not only not true that you can run on leadership, it's if you run on leadership, you're toast. But if you are still the leader and you try to run on other issues, I think you're still toast, because I think the leadership cloud is so big that no one is going to listen to anything they have to say as long as this guy is the front man for it. So, it's delusional is, I guess, the upshot. When he talks about Harper, just to draw a line under this, Harper in 2015 was polling 10 points, more than 10 points higher than he is right now. Like, how badly he is doing comparatively. When you say, the Harper government was sort of out of steam and, a little long in the tooth and all that. Yeah, it was that at like 32%. You guys are like 21. It's like a lot worse. And it's on its way to be even more bad, right? So, it's a false comparison, but in his mind, he's living in this time capsule of that period, but not even recognizing that the villain in that storyline for him, Stephen Harper, was 50% more popular than he is.
So, as they say in the North, winter is coming. Put a little more lyrically, the end of summer has arrived and passed. The palette of colors has changed, and we are all trying to enjoy the last bits of warmth. Soon enough, life will become more difficult. Our sponsor, CN, knows better than most what winter means. The railway produces a formal winter plan each year, detailing how it intends to cope with polar temperatures. As the railway's CEO, Tracy Robinson, puts it in this year's plan, when one operates the most northerly Class 1 railway in North America, one does what one must to keep the trains running during winter. That's Canadian understatement. Within a few months, CN trains will be rolling through some of the bitterest climates on Earth. Extreme cold basically attacks anything mechanical. Ice crystals can actually cut into steel wheels and train tracks. Rails become more brittle. Gaskets fail. Hoses freeze. And air brakes will break down if not scrupulously maintained. That last issue is the most serious. CN engineers have spent endless hours trying to figure out how to protect and boost the efficiency of air brakes, helping them slow a train's massive inertia in what railways call Tier 3 weather, meaning minus 36 Celsius or colder. The solution is air cars, rolling compressors spaced along the length of the train to boost air pressure and braking efficiency. Since air cars were invented in 2006, CN has spent tens of millions of dollars installing them in winter, along with winter-prepped locomotives that can achieve more traction. Also this year, CN is deploying the latest generation of AI-equipped rail cars that deploy ground-penetrating radar to inspect tracks at speed. To paraphrase a famous cyclist, it never gets easier. But with the right combination of gear and training, you can go faster. Scott, as Kory said, they'd spent a long time talking about proportional representation. I didn't hear any talk about foreshadowing a possible move on the consumer carbon tax going forward. I didn't hear any talk about affordability and what they might be doing in the next few months to deal with affordability. It seemed really disconnected from the current issue set.
Yeah, it was at least that bad. When inflation came up, it was spoken of by the prime minister as an issue that had been conquered. He used it as an illustration. You have to be careful about taking bets on the future because, Pierre Poilievre has wasted a year and a half talking about inflation when we see now that it's at 2%. And so, there are
problem
banners
solved
to be hung. And I think that really, that is a troubling a troubling insight into what logic might be popping around in his head in terms of how the voters view this, or the disconnect between how he sees it and how voters see it. Again, it's not just a Justin Trudeau thing. In government, you get governmentitis. So, we got new stats and look, they're good. And, that. The other point that you make, David, there about climate, a lot of conversation, a lot of references to climate and the absence of a credible climate plan on the part of Poilievre and how important it is. Yeah, like as if like that's gonna no, but seriously, there was that undertone of like, Jesus Christ, he's gonna rue the day that he ignored that issue. And but there's no indication of, we recognize, like, to me, a fundamental thing that the Liberal Party of Canada has to come to grips with between now and the next election, or God help us, in the aftermath of the next election, which could be humbling, is that it is possible to have a rigorous climate plan, but not necessarily a consumer carbon tax. And there was no suggestion that that logic is beginning to unfold, no hinting at it, no allowance for that possibility. And then finally, just to reinforce your point, I thought the present was even eclipsing perspectives on the past. Because when he talked about the 2015 campaign, forget about where Harper was and all those kinds of things, points that Kory's making. When he even talked about what his offering was to Canadians in 2015, my recollection is that the first thing that we're going to do was cut taxes for the middle class, that there was a message of middle-class economic opportunity.
Yep.
It was, and we make fun of it at sometimes, because it became a cliche, which is in some ways always a good sign. When something is so ubiquitous and so attached to a government that it becomes a cliche, that means that they've succeeded in landing it, and that is, the middle class and those seeking to join it. That's not how he recalled and shorthanded the 2015 election campaign. And I think that's exactly what's needed. Like, when we're talking about the fall economic statement, I want the fall economic statement to be, we're doing a couple things here that are NDP friendly so we can secure their votes, and we're going to cut taxes for the middle class, and we're going to say goodnight to Parliament for 4 months because Jesus Christ, what a goddamn misery it is. That would be taken from the 2015 mouth of Justin Trudeau. That's not what I heard of the podcast. I know I sound like such a fucking Eeyore, but God, man, really worried.
But Poilievre could run David Rosenberg's escalator ad right back at Trudeau right now.
Yeah. Well, right? Maybe somebody should find Sherry Butts' telephone number somewhere. Pass it over.
Well, I've got a radical suggestion, Kory, for these people. And it doesn't involve Jerry, but it does involve change, and more radical change than they are probably thinking about. But I've been thinking about this, and I mentioned a few weeks ago that I thought that that Don Guy would be the right person to run the campaign, but I gather he's not interested, and I gather they're having trouble finding somebody who is interested in running the campaign. And I know who should run the campaign. The campaign should be run by Katie Telford. Katie Telford should leave the Prime Minister's office and go run the campaign. She ran it in 2015. She knows how to do it. She's going to be intellectually in charge of it anyway. Right now, she's trying to do both things, both be the chief of staff to the Prime Minister and campaign manager. And those are both massively full-time jobs at the current point in time. And if Trudeau's going to ride into the orcs, as you say, right, who should be leading that charge with him? It should be her. And so that would allow them to get different voices to him in the Prime Minister's office and have the right person running the election campaign. That's what should happen now. And if she was thinking clearly, that's what she would do.
Well, quite possibly, David, right? Like I I think, though, part of it is not just like a campaign mechanics, but maybe it needs to be led from the party side, not from the government side. It's the core narrative. Like, that's what we keep coming back to is, if we're not going to be, to set aside all my pissy comments about narcissism and all the rest, but like get down to brass tacks, there has to be something akin to what you were talking about that did work for them in 2015, which is a narrative that is actually connected to current public opinion around what the problems are and what the solutions are and who you're fighting for and like what that issue set is. And you've got to be the embodiment of those forward-looking aspirations that the electorate has. And what he showed, and I think this is what kills a lot of governments over time, is that the narrative in his own mind as to where Canadians are at has not evolved. He is stuck in a moment in time in 2015, and a narrative around that just hasn't evolved. And like, he doesn't understand that he is actually the one who's offside right now. And when there are things like, well, inflation, he's like, oh yeah, well, we fixed that. So, good job, which is so disconnected with how people are feeling and what the reality of inflation is. The reality is things cost 25% more and my wages have gone up 3%. And so I'm way less well off. And oh, by the way, that higher, inflation is reflected in my newly renegotiated mortgage or my higher rent. And I'm basically fucked from a personal economic standpoint, but I'm glad you think that you fixed it and that I should move on. Fuck you very much is the answer. So, but it's that core narrative piece. It's not the campaign mechanics, and we can nitpick not going after Polyev and ads. I think it's a laughable explanation as to why that they didn't do that. But it's not that side of it. It's the core narrative, and I guess you could do that from PMO, or maybe you got to do it externally.
I think it's easier if she got out of there. If she got out of there, she could maybe have some perspective and immerse herself in the data that she loves, the dashboard, right? Dan Arnold's work, immerse herself in that and start to see it differently from the way she maybe is forced to see it sitting next to him all day long.
Well, you're looking at it through the issues and going to cabinet maybe, as opposed to a much clearer lens around, what is it the Canadians are saying and thinking.
Right. Jordan, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the recommendation to get out of the bunker is always a solid one. And really that there is going to be huge difficulties of gaining that perspective from inside the PMO right now. They are under siege internally, externally. And it's, you can't have that perspective from there. But I agree, like this issue of narrow progressive parties win when they can be perceived to be acting in the public good and acting in voters' interests. The narrative that the Prime Minister was articulating in that podcast was none of those things. And so until they're able to steer that ship around, there's nothing to build off of. They have to forge that connection with where voters are at right now and help people build that bridge. But really what we heard from the Prime Minister was that they are having no success in telling people of their past policy wins, and that's just something that's being discussed in caucus, and that they have no forward-looking vision to articulate, and that's just something that's being discussed in caucus and that they're working on. And so without any of these things, like he's offering, it's worse than nothing, because it's reinforcing the notion for the Conservatives that they can take that mantle of acting in voters' interests and of keeping what's at stake for the heart of their message.
Scott, any quick thoughts before we move on to our clipping?
Not much. To your proposal, not much. Because I like Katie, we've been friends for a long time, but I don't believe that. Okay, sure. There's always value in getting out of the bunker, but I heard the Prime Minister on that pod, and I heard the way he thinks about himself, the campaign, and the issues that he wants to put in front of Canadians. And I don't think that that perspective is going to change. And I don't think that perspective is going to change if Katie's sitting beside him in the PMO, or if she's sitting a phone call away from him at campaign headquarters. So I don't think that's going to remedy much.
It sounded like a closed mind. You were dealing with somebody with a very closed mind.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of something to say every week other than for him to resign. You know,
100%.
Just trying to shuffle up the order on the pod a little bit here, you know.
Yeah.
Somebody else should resign.
Fair enough. Variety is the spice of life, after all.
All right, let's get to this clipping. It's Campbell Clark in the Globe and Mail, and he says 9 months ago, Poilievre was pressed in an interview with Quebec's TVA network on how he'd balance the budget without cutting social programs. Journalist Emmanuel Letraverse asked whether a Conservative government would keep daycare and dental care programs. And Mr. Poilievre said he'd work with provinces to protect the programs people receive. But Ms. Letraverse asked again, you will keep those programs, or are you committed to not cutting them? We will not cut in programs that are already in place for Canadians, Mr. Poilievre answered. But that description doesn't apply to the proposed pharmacare plan, which the Liberals negotiated with the NDP. Pharmacare legislation has not yet been passed, and Mr. Poilievre has made it clear he's against that plan. And when it comes to the dental care program and $10 a day childcare, Mr. Poilievre has at times argued those programs don't actually exist. On Wednesday, Mr. Poilievre said Conservatives want to find out how many people are actually going to benefit in reality from dental care, not the promises, the talking points. He suggested the program had to be weighed against the economics, but Conservatives would ensure the less fortunate get the essentials of life. The seemingly clear answer that Poilievre gave last December has shifted. He moved to ambiguity, then to expressing doubt about those social programs, suggesting they need changes, and apparently inching toward the day when he can talk about cuts out loud. Okay, Jordan, what line is Poilievre trying to walk here?
Well, I think he's, for very understandable reasons, not wanting to define what cuts he would make, because this is probably one of the biggest vulnerabilities in his lead is the notion that he will cut social programs, particularly anything linked to healthcare. And so by being ambiguous about it, he's hopefully for him allowing himself not to be pinned down on it. And I liked this piece because I thought Campbell Clark did more noticing here, frankly, than we've seen from a lot of political parties in terms of the evolution of that narrative. And these are very carefully chosen words on the part of Mr. Poilievre. And this whole conceit around, well, does XYZ program exist or not exist? This is sort of like just the nonsense, like loophole rhetoric that he's using to create space for himself to later on say that he's going to cut these things. So this is the raw material of a very credible attack right here on the Conservative Party. This is what the New Democrats, this is what the Liberals should be talking about. And because it's so open-ended, and not only actually what Campbell Clark talked about in the piece, but also I think one of their big vulnerabilities as well is they talk about the $1 out of spending equals $1 of cuts. So that's also, again, kind of a recipe for really be anything, could be defined by your opponents in any way if they're not going to come out and say that. And of course, that's not what's happened yet. But I think that we are seeing him closing in on a theory of some of these, particularly these newer programs. I think on childcare, it's become fairly evident that what he's going to do is maintain the funding agreements, but really severely loosen the rules around what the provinces have to do with it, either in terms of universality, in terms of cost, in terms of private versus not-for-profit delivery. All of those things are now question marks. And then in terms of dental, I think that one is trickier because you do have 750,000 people who've now received care under this program. You have seniors receiving care under this program. It becomes much, much harder to take away. But the pharmacare program, I think as far as he's concerned, if you apply his own logic, that is done. So this is all ripe for other parties to take and to articulate and fill in those gaps and paint that picture as they're getting closer to the election. They are not going to be specific about this until we are like 2 weeks out from election day and they put forward their platform. Why would they? It just paints a target on them. So there's no waiting for more details on this. Other parties who want to pull their numbers down have to make those attacks right now.
Kory, why is he even remotely opening the door to cuts as opposed to sealing them off at this point in time? Is it core vote management? Or what's the thinking here?
You got to accept the premises, like so, and I don't on this piece. Like
okay.
Let's tip our hat to whoever in the NDP press office was able to find one of the few remaining journalists in Ottawa to write a little piece in behind a paywall in a paper read by dozens. So well done. I'm glad we're celebrating this non-event. Here.
It's a messenger.
And bloviating on about it. Look, some of these things, it comes down to a fundamental difference between conservatives and the Liberals and the NDP in terms of how you provide support in program areas that are provincial jurisdiction. And I know you guys like to sit at the center of confederation and dictate using money to override provincial jurisdiction as opposed to just providing money and allowing provinces to figure it out, which is, I guess I'll say that's not quite true. You'll let that happen in Quebec, but nowhere else in the country. And I don't see anything different than what has always been the case around how one executes programs in areas of provincial jurisdiction. There'll be more flexibility in terms of things that haven't passed.
But why is he talking about it? Why is he talking about it?
I would talk about not doing pharmacare all day long because nobody fucking wants it. And, there isn't a single premier in the country that wants it. There are.
It polls very well, Kory. It polls very well.
But not in.
Is he uncomfortable with contraception?
Yeah, you would love that to be the conversation, wouldn't you?
Well, I mean, he's opening the door.
You would,
right?
Okay, well, let's go. We've got Campbell Clark. The rest is going to be easy. All right, way to go. No, I don't think that is where people's heads at. And I would say on things like pharmacare, when you say it polls well, you bet an election campaign on that in 2018, and then when we got rid of pharmacare, there wasn't even a sparrow tweeting about it, right?
100%.
It just didn't.
I'm not
exist.
saying you can win an election on it, Kory. I've learned my lesson about that. I'm just saying it polls well.
Well, so what do I think if we're to attach this to our previous conversation? The place to be is talking about the big issues that are affecting lots of people, and those are around affordability and around economic management, and it's not around playing the game that the NDP and the Liberals want, which is about these niche policies for thimbles full of voters that are disconnected to what is actually keeping people awake at night, worrying about their life. It's just not this stuff. So I didn't see some big wedge and some secret agenda with parsed words and all of this bullshit that it was in that piece. I saw a conservative saying, we're going to continue to provide support to people who need it, but we're probably going to do it in a slightly different way that's a little more hands off. I think that is like conservative orthodoxy. And, why we're spending this much time talking about it is because it is the election narrative that the NDP and the Liberals want to have and aren't having success having. But way to go. You got one journalist to write it.
All right, Scott. Quickly,
you sure get pissy anytime somebody says something you don't like. That raises an issue that could be an uncomfortable burden that he's going to have to carry.
Look, the guy's got to. I do here.
All right.
You guys go on and fucking on. Jesus.
Here's the fucking.
Look at this energy Kory is bringing to this topic, friends.
Filibuster some more.
Here's the truth. The truth is that he knows that he can't maintain all of these programs, maintain the programs that are in the play, cut taxes deeply as he wishes to do, and balance the budget as he's always going to say he's going to do. So, it just doesn't all add up. He knows he wants to avoid being held to account on math and making it add up, but there is an impulse for him to kind of go, some of this stuff is bullshit. And so that's a little bit of that peeking out. And he's going to have to manage all of that. He's going to get a lot more of it. It isn't just going to be Campbell Clark. Between now and whenever election day is, he's going to get pressed harder and harder and more often on, well, wait a second, how can you possibly close this giant circle that you're drawing? And so They're going to have to figure
Ford
that
just
out.
said efficiencies in 2018, and that seemed to be good enough for people.
Yeah, and
you would
maybe
just
he'll
find
get
efficiencies in government. You don't need real answers to these things. Mulroney never fucking gave an inch on social programs before the 1984 election. Never gave an inch because Mulroney knew that when conservatives say that they're not going to cut social programs, people think that they will. And if they promise to, they really think they will.
Yeah.
So, right?
I think that's probably all. Yeah, exactly. So he'll have to figure out where he's going to land on this. But, I'll just say this, which last week you had this block motion. Everybody's going crazy, yanking themselves raw on it. And prior to the vote, a private member's bill that's in the, Jesus Christ, right?
Well, that's a good time to freeze.
Prior to the vote, I was hearing from conservatives, folks around Poilievre, flipping out about how horrifying and how brutally irresponsible, generationally irresponsible would be of the Liberals to cut this deal with the Bloc, to concede this much of the fisc to a rising OAS. And then they vote for it. So now I know they voted for it for political reasons. I know it's all bullshit. I know that it's not binding. I know it isn't a declaration and we would do it if we were in government, but it's incoherent. And it just means this is all bullshit politics, man. And that is the truth of the matter. As long as it's a change election, he's going to be able to get away with a bunch of bullshit politics, and he should just not talk about this stuff because it's not going to get him a single
get away
vote.
with it because there are people listening to this podcast now and we're talking about it, and some people have watched Emmanuel Latraverse, but not anyone probably outside of Quebec. And then there's Campbell Clark. You stack those things up and we basically changed the media landscape. The whole debate is now shifted. This is now the big issue.
Hey, you got to start somewhere. Kory. All right, Gordon Pinsent, it's your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
All right, Scott, you got to get out of here. What's your Hey You?
Well, my Hey You is that we're taping this on October 7th, and I don't mean to be heavy, but, 1 year ago today, the whole world changed literally. There's still 100 people or odd who are being held hostage by Hamas. A couple months ago, I went to someone's home. They had a talk. There was a person who was at one of the kibbutzes. He was responsible as sort of a militia responsibility.
I saw them.
It was that family story. The man had to run to an armory, get a gun, trying to defend the kibbutz. He got wounded, was against his wishes, airlifted out to save his life, and he was separated from his family. It took him weeks until he was reunited with them. Mercifully, magically, they managed to all live, and they were reunited. And I know lots of people have lots of strong feelings on this. So do I. And I want those 100 people home.
All right. Thank you. Kory, got a Hey You?
Yeah. Mine's going to go to Mirko Bibic and the folks at Bell. There was kind of a deep dive by Steve Marr in the Star around the incident that the Conservatives, I think quite rightly, drew a red circle around. It was a very perplexing set of edits made to a TV piece, and that sort of fundamentally changed what Poilievre was saying. It's really a serious failure in journalism. But I had not read yet a deep dive into what actually went on there, and what it appears to me is that well, I'm sure there are places, and I know there are places in the media where people's ideology, trumps good journalistic practice. I don't think that's what happened in this particular case. I think it's the consequence of too many cuts and not enough resources to actually provide editorial oversight and supervision in a news outlet. And I understand, that first of all, I think Mirko's a really good guy, and I think he's well-intended, and I think he's doing what you should be doing at a company, which is, protecting the interests of your shareholders, which in the case of Bell is basically, everyone with any sort of investment in the market. But there is reputational damage that has been done to Bell as a result of this. And you got to kind of look at the full equation there. The cost of running a news organization can be trimmed, but only to a certain point. And past a certain point, you're going to have mistakes like this one. Yeah, you're going to have the kinds of mistakes that were made there, and that creates reputational damage, which is a risk for your company. It's a risk for your shareholders, and you got to, I think, take a more balanced approach as to how you look at those expenditures. You can't keep cutting and cutting and cutting and putting out the amount of content that you are without assuming a huge risk that things like that are going to happen. And when they happen, the whole company wears it and can send it into a tailspin. So I don't know. What's my hey you? Hey, be cautious around what you're doing in this area, because I think it shows the risks that you're taking by cutting past a certain point.
Yeah, good point. Thanks, Kory. Jordan?
My hey you this week is going out to the Bloc. What gives, guys? You had a moment. You had control. You had the Liberals in the palm of your hand, and I think you guys burned a little too hot and a little too fast. It is not a race, and I think that the challenge that the Bloc has now found themselves in is that by voting non-confidence in the government, by not actually negotiating or preconditioning any of their demands, they have now showed themselves to be very ineffectual. They've handed the reins back to the New Democrats, and it's pretty difficult to see them having another crack at the can because they went so hot so fast in this round. So I thought that was a really weird strategy. I can understand if the Bloc, given their numbers, are keener to go into an election than perhaps the New Democrats and the Liberals, but it doesn't make any sense to hand it all over strategically back to the NDP for them. So my hey you is, you guys got to do better. Missed an opportunity.
Yeah, excellent. Cool point. My hey you is very similar to Scott's. It's building on October 7th. We did a podcast, I think, the day after that in Ottawa at a CEJA event. So it's very fresh for all of us at that time. Anyway, a year later, that attack was so horrible, and the predictable ramifications of it have been really horrible. And it's been a very, very sad year. And my heart goes out to all the families in Israel that were destroyed by the Hamas attack of October 7th. And my heart goes out to all the civilians on all sides whose lives have been destroyed in the year since then. I believe in the Jewish people's right to live safely and securely in Israel, and I hope that this year finds us getting closer to that target. So, hey, you.
Here.
All right, I'd like to thank you, too, and Scott, who's left us, for being here this morning. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, and all of you hurly-burlyites and accursed who watched or listened today. Thanks for being with us. We'll be back next week, and probably we'll still think Trudeau should resign. See you then.